The spring of 1883 came late to the Platte River Valley, and when it finally arrived, it did not come gently. It came with mud that swallowed boot heels to the ankle and cold rains that turned the wagon track into a brown river running between the claims. It came with wind that peeled shingles from rooftops and scattered the seed catalogs that hopeful farmers had been reading through all of February beside their oil lamps. It came, in other words, the way most things came to that stretch of Nebraska: hard, indifferent, and beautiful in spite of itself. Their claim sat at the low end of a gentle slope, just where the ground flattened out near a bend in a shallow creek. 40 acres of it. They had filed the previous summer, broken their first sod in August heat that left them both sunburned to the collar, and spent the winter in a dugout they had cut into the bank with a borrowed spade and roofed with split cottonwood poles and a layer of prairie sod 2 feet thick. It was dark inside and it smelled of earth and wool, but it held warmth like a cupped hand holds water, and they had come through the winter without losing a single chicken. He was 28. She was 26. They had been married 3 years, long enough to know the sound of each other's breathing in the dark, long enough to have stopped explaining every thought and started finishing each other's sentences instead. The corn was everything this year, not figuratively, literally everything. The seed money was spent. The last of the smoked pork from autumn was down to the rind. If the corn came up short, there would be no buffer, no cushion, nothing to carry them through another winter except what they could borrow. And borrowing from the other settlers on that slope meant borrowing from men who watched their neighbors' failures the way crows watch a sick calf. The claim that bordered theirs to the north belonged to a family who had come up from Missouri with 2 wagons, 3 hired men, a mechanical corn planter, and an opinion about everything. The father was broad-shouldered and loud, the kind of man who planted his boots wide when he stood and never seemed to wonder whether anyone wanted to hear him speak. His 2 older sons had their father's volume without their father's occasional flashes of humor. Together, the 3 of them managed 80 acres, and they managed it with the particular confidence of men who have never yet been surprised by a bad outcome. They had already stopped twice at the fence line to watch him carry the first of the barrels down from the dugout. The barrel was old, staved oak, and it smelled powerfully of vinegar and fermented mash before he even pried the lid loose. She came out behind him with the long-handled ladle and the look on her face that she wore when she knew exactly what she was doing and had no interest in explaining it to anyone who hadn't asked. The watching from the fence began before noon. The older son came to the fence first. He rested his forearms on the top rail the way a man does when he intends to stay a while, and he watched without speaking for a time, which was the most charitable thing he did all afternoon. She had already marked the first trench line with a length of cord staked at both ends, running parallel to where the seed rows would go. It was not a deep trench, 4 inches, no more, and she had cut it with the narrow spade herself, while he wrestled the second barrel up from the dugout's cool dark. The mash inside had been working since April, vinegar sharp and brown as old creek water, the lees from the previous autumn's cider pressing mixed through with wood ash, and a handful of sulfur she had traded for at the dry goods in Lander before the roads turned. Her grandmother had kept the recipe on a folded paper tucked inside a tin box. She had kept the folded paper tucked inside her memory instead, which she trusted more than tins. "What in thunder are you pouring into the ground?" the son called out. He set the barrel down and looked over. Old mash, he said, which was true and complete, and apparently insufficient. Vinegar mash. The son said it the way a person repeats something they've heard wrong. You're poisoning your own dirt. Conditioning it, she said, without looking up from the trench. There was a pause. Then the son laughed. Not unkindly exactly, but with the full confidence of a man who has never needed to question his own conclusions. He called, back toward his family's field, and within a few minutes the father had walked over with his other son, and the three of them stood at the fence like a panel of judges at a county fair, except there was no ribbon worth winning from any of them. The father squinted at the barrels, at the trench, at the dark liquid seeping down into the clay. My daddy planted corn, he said. His daddy planted corn. Never once needed to sour the ground first. Different ground, she said. He said nothing to that. He was busy tipping the barrel to a slow pour, letting the mash run even, watching it darken the soil edge in a way that satisfied something in him. Some old instinct he couldn't have put a name to, but recognized whenever it showed up. The father and his sons watched for another quarter hour. They made two more remarks, one about waste and one about the smell, and then they went back to their own field, which was already furrowed clean and ready for the mechanical planter that could set seed at twice the pace of any hand-pushed row marker. Their corn would go in tomorrow morning. Theirs would go in the day after, once the mash had time to settle into the first inches of soil and begin its quiet work. The smell drifted east on the afternoon wind, sharp and insistent, crossing the fence line without asking permission. The day after the mash went in, she woke before him. That was not unusual. She had always been the earlier riser, the one who stood in the doorway with her coffee tin while the sky was still deciding what color it intended to be. But this morning, she walked straight past the stove and out into the field without shoes, feeling the cool ground under her feet, moving between the trenches carefully so as not to disturb what had settled there overnight. The soil along the trench edges had darkened and dried to a crust that crumbled when she pressed it with her thumb. Beneath the crust it was still damp, still carrying the sharp mineral smell of the mash, still alive with whatever process the vinegar acids had started in the clay. She crouched down and worked a small handful loose, rubbing it between her palms the way her grandmother had taught her. Not to test it scientifically, but to feel whether it had changed its character, whether it had loosened. It had. Even a little. Even just enough. She stood and looked east across the fence. Their neighbors had been out since first light. She could see the mechanical planter moving in straight passes, the youngest son walking behind it to check the depth, the father standing at the field edge with his arms crossed in that satisfied way he had, the way of a man who believes the world is proceeding correctly because he is in it. Their rows were already half done, clean, precise, spaced to the inch. She felt something then that she would not have called envy, exactly. More like the particular loneliness of knowing that your method is right, but that you cannot yet prove it to anyone, including yourself. He came out 40 minutes later with 2 tins of coffee and found her still standing at the fence line. He handed her a tin without a word and stood beside her, watching the planter move. "They'll be done by noon," he said. "Yes." "We plant tomorrow." "Yes." He drank his coffee. A meadowlark landed on their fence post and regarded them both for a long moment before deciding they were not interesting enough to bother with and flying off toward the creek. "You think it worked," he said. It was not quite a question. "I think it started," she said. "Working and worked are two different things." He nodded at that. He appreciated the distinction. It was the kind of thought she had that kept him honest, the kind that reminded him that hope and certainty were not the same thing, and that confusing them was how a man ended up broken on this land. They finished their coffee standing together at the fence, watching the neighbor's planter make its passes, watching the clean rows appear one after another in that field that had always cooperated, that had never needed convincing, that had given back year after year without argument. Their own field sat quiet behind them, still souring, still changing, still in the middle of its own slow process that no one watching from the outside would have recognized as anything but a mess. The planting took them 2 days instead of one. The soil fought them in the way that amended soil sometimes does, dense in places, soft in others, behaving like a thing still making up its mind. He worked the hand planter in careful rows, feeling the resistance change under his palms, learning what the field was now, which was not quite what it had been 2 weeks ago, and not yet what he hoped it would become. She walked behind him with the seed pouch, dropping kernels at measured intervals, pressing each one down with her thumb before covering it, giving it a deliberate burial that felt almost like a promise. Neither of them spoke much while they worked. There was a kind of seriousness that settled over planting that had nothing to do with ceremony and everything to do with the fact that this was the moment when a year's worth of preparation became either meaningful or wasted. You did not talk idly through that. The neighbor's boy came to the fence line twice on the second day. The first time he said nothing, only stood and watched, the way a boy does when he has been sent to observe something and report back. The second time he asked, without much friendliness, what they were putting in the ground. She told him corn. The boy looked at the soil, still darker than it should have been, still carrying that faint sour smell that the recent rains had not fully erased, and he said it looked sick. She said that was one way of looking at it. The boy went back across the fence. She did not let it settle into her. She had made a choice about what she would allow to take root in her mind, the same way she had made a choice about what to put in the ground, and idle doubt from a neighbor's child was not on either list. By the second evening they had finished. The field lay before them in the long light, quiet and furrowed, giving nothing away. He walked the rows once end to end with his hands clasped behind his back, the way she had seen him do since the first year, counting something she could never quite identify. Steps, maybe, or his own private measure of whether the work had been done right. When he came back, he did not say anything immediately. He stood beside her, and they both looked at the field in the way that people look at something they have committed to, but cannot yet verify. "Now we wait," he said. "Now we wait," she agreed. It was not a hard thing to say. Waiting was the central skill of this life, not patience in the soft sense, not the patience of people who had other things to occupy them, but the sharp-edged waiting of those who had nothing to do but watch and work and hold their judgment until the land had given its own answer. They had grown good at it without meaning to. The field held its silence through the night while the neighbors' green rows already showed their first pale threads above the dark. The neighbors' threads became blades within the week. She watched them from the fence line on a Tuesday morning with her arms folded over the top rail. her chin resting on her wrists, studying the way the green pushed up out of the dark soil with that confident, uncomplicated strength that healthy young corn has in the early days. There was no denying what she saw. The Harmon field, 300 yards east, was doing exactly what corn was supposed to do in the first weeks of June in the Wyoming Valley. Rising straight, spreading color, announcing itself without reservation. Their own rouse remained quiet. He told her not to read into silence. The vinegar mash was working on the soil's deeper chemistry, not its surface appearance, and the surface was the last place to look for evidence of what was happening underground. She had heard this from him before. She believed it the way she believed most things he said, not blindly, not completely, but with the specific trust that comes from watching a person be right about difficult things, often enough to earn a measured faith. Still, she watched the Harmon field. On the third Thursday of June, a man rode past on the road between their properties and pulled his horse up short when he saw her at the fence. He was not from town. She did not know his face. He looked at the Harmon rows, which were now a full hand's height above the soil, and then he looked at her own field, which remained brown and quiet, with only the faintest suggestion of green at the soil line, if you stood close and looked carefully with good light behind you. He did not say anything. He just looked from one field to the other, and then back at her. And something in his expression held the particular quality of a man drawing a conclusion he had already prepared before arriving. Then he clicked his tongue to the horse and moved on down the road. She did not tell her husband about the rider. There was no point in adding his look to the inventory of doubts they were already managing. What she did instead was go back to the root cellar that afternoon and pull out the record book where she had been keeping notes since February. Soil color, moisture by feel, the smell of the mash at each application, the way the ground had taken or resisted the poured liquid at each trench. She had written it all down because he had taught her early that memory is not a reliable witness when you are tired, and they were almost always tired. She read back through the entries looking for the place where the math had to resolve itself. The mash needed between 22 and 28 days to break down the alkaline crust that lay 18 inches below the surface in this particular patch of valley floor. She had read this in her husband's old papers, which he had carried from his grandfather's farm in the old country, wrapped in oilcloth inside the wagon box. They were at day 19. Day 19 meant 3 to 9 days remaining, and she was not a woman who found comfort in ranges. She wanted the number. She wanted to know exactly when the crust would yield, exactly when the roots would find the deeper moisture that the alkaline shelf had been locking away since before anyone had broken this ground. But the old papers her husband had translated for her, letter by letter, sitting together at the table on winter evenings with a single candle between them, did not give exact numbers. They gave approximations drawn from a different soil, a different latitude, a different grandfather's careful watching. She would have to watch, too. She closed the record book and carried it back to the shelf her husband had fitted between the root cellar's two main support posts. The shelf he had built level on ground that was not quite level, shimming the back edge with a piece of split cedar until the surface ran true. Small things like that were how she knew him. The shelf said, "I want your things to stay where you put them." That evening he came in from the trenches with his boots dark to the ankle and his hands smelling of the mash, which had a sharp and living smell by now, almost like bread gone wrong, almost like something being remade. She had water heated and a cloth ready without him asking. He sat down on the porch step and pulled off his boots, and she handed him the cloth, and he looked up at her with that expression he sometimes wore when gratitude was too plain a word for what he felt. He said the soil at the third trench was changing. She asked him how. He said it was harder to explain than to see, but that when he pressed the heel of his spade into the floor of the trench, there was a different give to it. Not soft, not loose, but less locked, as though something underneath had begun to release its grip. She told him they were at day 19. He was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then he said that matched. That matched what his grandfather had written about the third or fourth week, being when you first heard the ground change its mind. She liked that phrasing. She wrote it down after supper, while he checked the harness for the following morning. Heard the ground change its mind. It went into the record book beneath the day's temperature and moisture notes, because that kind of observation belonged alongside the measurable ones. Her grandfather had been a school teacher and had told her once that the most important data is the kind you cannot put a number to, which had seemed like a strange thing for a school teacher to say, and which had taken her 20 years and a homestead in a difficult valley to fully understand. What she had not written down was the rider who had come by that morning. That stayed outside the record book, in the category of things that were real, but that she would not give the dignity of ink. She would deal with it in her own way, in her own time. She just did not yet know what that way would be. The rider had been one of the men from the neighboring claim. The younger one, not the father, but the son who had a habit of sitting his horse too close when he talked, as though distance were a form of respect he had not been taught. He had come under the pretense of asking about the creek line, whether she and her husband had noticed any change in the flow since last month. But the question had been thin, and they had both known it. What he had really come to do was look. His eyes had moved across the trenches, across the standing corn, across the barrels she had left stacked against the south wall of the barn. He had not said anything about them directly. Instead, he had made a remark about the smell, something about how a person could tell from the road or what sort of farming was happening on a property, and whether that farming was the kind a man could be proud of. She had thanked him for stopping by and told him the creek line was unchanged. Now, 3 days after that visit, she was watching the neighbor's field from the high ground near their eastern fence post, and she was watching it the way you watch something you already know the answer to, but are not ready to say out loud. The corn over there had been going in flat-soiled ground without treatment, in the same heavy clay that sat beneath the whole basin. It had come up fast, faster than theirs at first, because new growth in unworked ground often shoots quick before it runs out of what little is there to take. But it was slowing. She could see it from here. The color was not quite right. A yellow-green that was trying to pass for healthy but wasn't. The stalks were tall enough to seem promising from a distance, which was probably why the family across the fence had not yet named what they were seeing. It was the kind of problem that announced itself in stages, and they were still in the early stages, the ones where hope could still argue with evidence. Her husband came up beside her and stood without speaking for a moment. He said their corn had gone another 2 inches since Tuesday. She said she knew. She had measured it that morning before he was awake, He asked if she had written it down. She said she had written all of it down. They stood together a little longer, looking first at their own field, where the stalks were dense and dark and leaning gently in the afternoon air, and then at the neighbor's field, where something was quietly going wrong in a way that no amount of later work would easily undo. The vinegar mash had done what it was supposed to do. The slow acid, the broken clay, the change in what the soil would allow. It was all happening underneath the visible surface, the way most important things did. She thought about what the writer had said about pride. She thought about the record book waiting on the table inside, and about whether there was a column for this particular kind of patience. The days that followed had their own particular quality, different from the weeks before. There was still work. There was always work. But the work had changed its character. Before, she and her husband had been laboring against doubt, against the opinions of neighbors and the silence of soil that hadn't yet answered them. Now they were laboring inside something that was already beginning to speak. The stalks spoke. The record book spoke. The morning measurements, which she took with a worn length of cord she had knotted at regular intervals, spoke clearly enough that she had started writing the numbers in ink rather than pencil. Her husband spent 3 days reinforcing the windbreak on the north edge of the field, stacking cut cedar posts and weaving dried brush between them the way his grandmother had described, protecting her kitchen garden against the lake winds back in Pennsylvania. He did not talk about the neighbor's field while he worked. She noticed this and said nothing about it. There were things that didn't need to be spoken to be understood between them. She had begun to see other farmers from the road more often now, some on horseback, some walking the long, dry margin between the fields, and she understood what they were doing, even if none of them said it plainly. They were looking. The neighbor's stalks had a color that wasn't quite right, a faint yellow beginning at the leaf edges, the kind of yellow that looked like thirst even when the soil had been watered. She had seen that color before in her father's fields, the year a hard mineral seam had broken through, close to the surface, and poisoned the drainage. The plants had not died all at once. They had declined. There was a cruelty in that kind of slow failing that she did not feel glad about, even now. Her husband came to her one evening and said a man from the east side of the county had stopped him on the road and asked what they were putting in those trenches last winter. He had told him plainly, the vinegar mash, the broken grain, the slow acid treatment, the way it loosened clay and changed what the roots could reach. The man had listened carefully and had not laughed. Her husband said the man's expression had been the expression of someone adding a column of numbers in his head and arriving at an answer he hadn't expected. She asked what her husband had told him. He said he had told him the truth, all of it, including where the method had come from and how long it had taken to show results. She thought about that. There had been a time when she would have kept the knowledge close, protective of the small advantage it represented. But the field was already proving itself beyond argument, and protection felt less necessary than it once had. She pulled the record book from the shelf and opened it to a fresh page. There might be more worth writing down than she had first planned for. She wrote the date at the top of the page and then sat for a moment with the pen resting in her hand, deciding what mattered most to record. Not just the measurements, she thought. Not just the yield counts and the row distances and the number of barrels used. Those things were important, but they were the kind of facts a person could arrive at through experiment alone. What she wanted to write down was the order of things, the sequence, when to begin the trench preparation relative to the first hard frost, how long to let the mash sit before covering it, what the soil smelled like when it had taken the treatment properly versus when it had not. The reasoning behind each choice, not merely the choice itself. She wrote steadily for nearly an hour, while her husband sat at the table mending a length of harness leather by lamplight. The cabin was quiet except for the occasional settling of the fire and the sound of the awl going through the leather with a soft, rhythmic punch. Outside, the autumn wind had picked up and was moving through the dry corn rows with a paper rustling sound that she had come to think of as the field talking to itself after the work was done. When she paused and read back over what she had written, she was surprised by how much there was. 2.5 pages already, and she had not yet reached the spring planting or the trench filling. She had written about the clay soil and why the usual methods failed it. She had written about the first small test her husband's grandmother had described, on a hillside in a river valley where the ground held water like a clay bowl and refused to release it. She had written about how they had adapted that original method here, in different soil, different elevation, different rainfall, and what adjustments had been necessary. Her husband looked up from the harness and watched her writing for a moment, without speaking. Then he said that if she was going to write it all down properly, she ought to include what not to do as well. She asked him what he meant. He said the first year's mistakes were as instructive as anything else, and someone starting fresh ought to know where the trouble was most likely to come from. She considered that and agreed with him, and she turned back a few lines and added a note in the margin. There was a practical kindness in the idea, she thought. A person who had only read about a method could still walk into the first season with some protection against the errors she and her husband had already made, already absorbed, already paid for with a season's labor. She wrote a heading on a fresh line, cautions beneath it. She began to list what she knew. The lamp burned low before she was finished, and she trimmed the wick without stopping. There was more to put down than one evening would hold, and she intended to use what light she had. The lamp held through most of another hour before the oil ran too low to read by, and she set down the pen and closed the journal carefully, pressing the cover flat with both palms as though sealing something in. Her husband had finished with the harness and hung it on its peg, and he stood in the doorway between the workroom and the main cabin, watching her in the dim and fading light. She told him the cautions section alone would need another sitting to finish properly. He said that was all right. The journal wasn't going anywhere. She carried the lamp to the table and turned the wick down to nothing, and they sat together in the dark for a little while, without needing to fill it with words. Outside, the September air had cooled, and through the single west-facing window, the last gray edge of twilight was nearly gone. Somewhere down past the lower fence line, a meadowlark was calling late, one of the last of the season, and they both heard it without remarking on it. She had been thinking all evening, while she wrote, about the spring they had come to this piece of ground. She had been thinking about what they had seen when they first walked the acreage, the pale, exhausted color of the soil, the crust of it, the way nothing grew near the fence corners but thistle and dry grass. They had stood side by side and looked at it together, and she remembered that neither of them had flinched. They had talked about what was possible. They had not talked about what wasn't. She thought that was perhaps the most important thing. Not the vinegar mash, not the timing of the trench work, not the depth of the furrows or the selection of seed. Those things mattered, and she had written them all down faithfully. But what had made them possible in the first place was something harder to put in a journal. The willingness to look at worn-out ground and believe it could be asked to give again. She said this to him quietly. He was quiet for a moment after. Then he said he believed that was true. He said he thought it applied to most things, not only soil. She understood what he meant, and she reached across the table and found his hand in the dark. They did not speak again for a while. The meadowlark had gone silent. The nighttime sounds of the homestead settled in around them. The creak of the roof timber cooling, the soft movement of the horse in the lean-to, the far-off murmur of the creek finding its way over the stones in the lower draw. There was a full harvest put by. There was a journal begun. There was a second season already waiting somewhere ahead of them in the dark, asking to be met the same way the first one had been met, with patience, with attention, and with enough faith in each other to begin again.